In early September 1944, when the Allied forces were approaching the West Wall, 14 weeks had passed since the D-Day landings in Normandy. The West Wall, the fortifications protecting Germany's western border, lay 300 miles inland from the Normandy beaches. But that was not the only way the distance could be calculated. It was also measured in slog and slaughter, hardship and destruction, trauma and exhaustion. After the D-Day landings in Normandy, hundreds of thousands of men had been killed on both sides, scores of them at a time, to gain, then often lose, just a few yards of ground. Thousands of acres of countryside were laid waste and littered with the burned-out wrecks of tanks, guns, and vehicles. Towns and villages were left a mess of smoking ruins. Eventually, German forces fleeing from the Battle of Normandy had been trapped in the Falaise Argentin pocket. Those who managed to escape were pursued all the way to the German border. The Germans fled in disarray, often in panic, but anyone who believed that they were finished was very much mistaken. Once they reached the safety of the West Wall, the Germans took on a new guise, no longer an exhausted enemy on the run, but defenders encased in fortifications of concrete and steel, which they believed to be impregnable. Originally, the West Wall, begun in 1938, had been Germany's answer to the Maginot Line, which protected eastern France from attack across the Rhine. The two fortifications faced each other across a short stretch of territory in the Saar region of southwest Germany, but the value of the West Wall at that time was diplomatic rather than military. Adolf Hitler found it very useful as a frightener. The West Wall, later known to the Allies as the Siegfried Line, helped the Führer scare the governments of Britain and France into making concessions, so feeding their policy of appeasement. It was March 1939 when Germany invaded Czechoslovakia, before the British and the French at last woke up to reality. By then, the Second World War was only 6 months away. After the German conquest of France in 1940, the West Wall became irrelevant. Its machine guns and cannon were removed and sent to the Atlantic Wall, and the fortifications fell into disrepair. Even the D-Day landings in June 1944 failed to prompt the Germans to make efforts at getting the wall into better shape. It was not until the following August, when they'd already lost the Battle of Normandy, that the Germans began to think the unthinkable. The fatherland itself might soon be invaded. The potential of the West Wall could no longer be ignored. On Hitler's orders, some 360,000 civilians and boys from the Hitler Youth were set to work repairing and rearming the dilapidated defense line. Considering the short time available, this scratch workforce achieved wonders. When they'd finished, some parts of the West Wall remained weak, but others had been greatly strengthened. And even in this state, the wall was still a formidable barrier. The fortifications formed a band of natural and artificial defenses up to 5 miles deep, stretching some 400 miles from the southwest corner of the Netherlands to the Swiss border. The West Wall featured around 22,000 pillboxes, troop shelters and command posts, all interlinked and all mutually supportive. In some places, such as the rivers Rhine, Ruhr and Kiel, the terrain provided natural obstacles to invasion. Where the lie of the land failed to oblige, concrete pyramids called dragon's teeth were planted in parallel rows to obstruct attackers. Nazi propaganda, of course, touted the West Wall as impregnable. Its real purpose was not to repulse assaults, but to hold up the enemy long enough for mobile reserves to arrive and stage counterattacks. Even so, for the Allies in 1944, the difference was academic. The reality of the West Wall matched the propaganda for a very long time. Only about 12% of the German 7th Army, or rather its decimated remnants, had managed to escape from the Falaise Argentin Gap in August 1944. But before long, these remnants had formed up along the West Wall and were soon being joined by reinforcements. The German High Command had given the Western defences priority, and units were transferred from the Italian front and the garrisons in Norway and Denmark. They were also removed from the Eastern Front, even though the Russians were fast approaching the Prussian border and were about to break into Germany. Nothing underlined the emergency at the West Wall more than this. For the Germans, the Russians were the most terrifying of all enemies, and civilians awaited their arrival with dread. Nevertheless, the defense against them in the east was salted for manpower, which was rushed across Germany to face the imminent danger in the west. When all were in place, the West Wall and its adjacent areas were being defended as far as the river Mersel by Army Group B under Field Marshal Walter Model, and as far as Karlsruhe by Army Group G under General Hermann Balck. The rest of the fortifications down to the border with Switzerland was defended by SS troops under their chief, Heinrich Himmler. The enormous losses the Germans had already suffered by 1944 meant that they were unable to build up the West Wall garrison to the size its designers had envisaged. However, the problems facing the Allies gave them the chance to make the best of what they had. Exhaustion after the long chase from Falaise was only one of these problems. The Allies' other difficulties were much more fundamental. The Allied forces were suffering the usual fate of modern mechanized armies that advance too fast and too far for their support elements to keep pace with them. Their lines of supply were overstretched, and petrol and ammunition were running low. The Allied air forces and other support units were unable to extend their activities with the same speed. The Americans had no prior experience of assaulting heavy fortifications, and the lessons learned in military training proved to be of little practical use. The terrain had changed, too. Unlike the plains of Normandy, the hills and valleys of the Lorraine area around the West Wall had few roads for tanks and armoured vehicles, and in places featured dense woodland that was hard to penetrate and very difficult to fight in. The most immediate problem, however, was the shortage of fuel. It was so serious that General Patton's Third Army was brought to a halt with empty fuel tanks at the River Meuse on the 30th of August. Patton wanted to move on. He was convinced that his forces could be through the wall and at large inside Germany within 10 days. But to Patton's fury, General Eisenhower allocated what little fuel there was to his hated rival, Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, for an advance into Belgium and the Netherlands by the British 21st Army Group. This offensive had two prime purposes. First, to facilitate the capture of Antwerp, a much nearer port than those in Normandy, so the Allies would be able to shorten their critically extended supply lines. Secondly, if Germany could be invaded from the north through the Low Countries, it might shorten the war and save millions of casualties. This, in fact, had been the Allies' chosen strategy when the invasion of Germany was being planned before D-Day. Montgomery's offensive proved to be a tragic disaster. Antwerp was captured on the 4th of September, but German resistance was very much stronger than expected. The Germans blocked the Scheldt estuary, making Antwerp useless for Allied purposes. By the 26th of September, the Allied airdrops at Arnhem had failed at a cost of 7,000 killed, wounded, or captured. General Eisenhower had assumed direct command of ground operations from a very resentful Montgomery on the 3rd of September, and now he was back to square one. After Arnhem, the German defences were still intact, and assaulting the West Wall the hard way, head-on, was the only remaining option. It was not a welcome prospect. Autumn was fast approaching, and with it the chance of torrential rains, mud, cold, overcast skies, and all their attendant miseries. The Allies were in for a very long haul. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, a Prussian aristocrat of the traditional military school, was not entirely trusted by Hitler, who hated his caste out of hand. Rundstedt, for his part, had contempt for both the Führer and the Nazi creed. Despite this mutual disdain, von Rundstedt kept well away from the plots to murder Hitler that occupied his fellow officers. Hitler, for his part, realized that he could not afford to waste von Rundstedt's experience and professionalism, especially after several leading officers had been removed for their involvement in the bomb plot designed to kill the Führer in July 1944. Von Rundstedt had fought in the First World War, where he distinguished himself in the Alsace campaign, and later on both the Eastern and the Western fronts. In the Second World War, he directed operations in France in 1940 and in Russia the following year, and was Supreme Commander of the German forces in Normandy at the time of the D-Day landings. Dismissed for daring to suggest that Hitler make peace, the third time in his career he'd been removed from duty, von Rundstedt was recalled 2 months later, on the 5th of September 1944, to lead the German defense of the West Wall. He remained on active service for the next 6 months until Germany was on the brink of defeat, and retired on the 13th of March 1945, just as the Battle of the West Wall was coming to its end. After the German surrender, there was talk that von Rundstedt should be put on trial at Nuremberg, but he was regarded more as a professional soldier who had done his duty, rather than a war criminal who had abused his position. Geert von Rundstedt died in 1953 at the age of 78. Field Marshal Walter Model was the complete opposite of von Rundstedt. Model shared Hitler's dislike of the Prussian military caste to which von Rundstedt belonged, and his loyalty to the Führer never wavered. In 1944, after Hitler survived the bomb plot to kill him, Model was the first commander on the Eastern Front to send him a telegram reaffirming his allegiance. Rough, aggressive, and outspoken, Model's loyalty earned him an advantage not given to many other officers in the Wehrmacht. He was able to ignore the Führer's more impossible orders, act first and receive permission afterwards, and voice some very unpalatable truths. When Model took over from the disgraced Hans Gunther von Kluge as commander of Army Group B in Normandy, the first thing he did was tell Hitler that defeat in France was inevitable. Other high-ranking officers had been dismissed for less. Model's fighting experience in the war was considerable. He served in Poland and commanded the 3rd Panzer Division in Russia, as well as taking charge in Normandy in August 1944. He became known as Hitler's fireman for his skill in shoring up broken fighting fronts. His luck inevitably ran out at the West Wall. Model directed a ferocious defense of the Moselle section assigned to his Army Group B, but in the end he was forced to yield to the massive Allied onslaughts. In April 1945, Model's Army Group B was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket. Rather than accept defeat, he dissolved his forces and gave them the choice of going home, fighting on with other units, or surrendering. Model had always despised Field Marshal von Paulus for capitulating at Stalingrad in 1943 and had no intention of emulating him. Instead, he shot himself on the 21st of April 1945 because he had said a Field Marshal did not surrender. What is there left, he once asked, to a commander in defeat? Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges was taciturn and uncommunicative. He shunned the limelight to such an extent that General Eisenhower despaired of obtaining for him the recognition he deserved as commander of the US First Army. It was possibly part of a campaign by Eisenhower to heighten Hodges' profile that his troops became the first of the Allied forces to cross the Rhine in 1945. During the interwar years, Hodges was spotted as a promising prospect by General George C. Marshall, future Chief of Staff in the Second World War, who brought him to Washington as Chief of Infantry. Early in 1944, Hodges was in England as deputy to General Omar Bradley during the planning of the D-Day landings. On the 1st of August, Hodges inherited Bradley's command as leader of the First Army. Hodges retired soon after the war as a 4-star general, and he died in 1966. With his understated manner and aversion to publicity, Hodges was one of the quiet men of the American High Command, rarely raising his voice to get things done. Unfortunately, he struck the lower ranks as cold and colourless, and had nothing like the flamboyant pattern's popular appeal. Bradley, however, appreciated Hodges' qualities, especially his insistence on detailed planning, and once said that he had implicit faith in Hodges' judgment, skill, and restraint. During the Second World War, US infantry units received close-fit support from mortars, which they called pocket artillery. The largest mortar in use at this time was the 4.2-inch chemical mortar, which weighed 330 pounds and could fire up to 20 rounds per minute, though only for short periods. Initially, the function of the chemical mortar was to provide smoke, gas, toxic agents, or incendiaries in support of infantry operations. Then, late in 1942, the 4.2-inch mortar was fitted with a high explosive capability, which greatly increased its uses for the 18 battalions that used it in the European theatre. Experiments to lengthen the range of the 4.2-inch mortar were overtaken by the end of the war in Europe, but a month later, in June 1945, tests showed that the weapon was now able to fire over distances of up to 5,600 yards. Development continued until 1951, by which time the chemical mortar had won its spurs as a legitimate infantry weapon. The pillboxes of the West Wall were strong points, arsenals and underground shelters combined. The reinforced concrete roofs were up to 7.5 feet thick, and the walls were more than 6.5 feet thick. The roof rested on steel beams up to a foot thick, and there were two 1.1-inch steel doors. The regular pillboxes of the West Wall were interspersed with larger, multi-story structures, like the Cat's Head armoured fort near the village of Irel in the South Eifel.
Fahrstühle verbinden die verschiedenen Stockwerke.
Its foundations were dug to a depth of 118 feet, and the fort contained 3 stories with reversible turret cannon, automatic flamethrowers and machine guns. The rooms were air-conditioned, providing plenty of comfort for its 84-man crew, who could remain at the Cat's Head for 6 weeks at a time. The typical West Wall pillbox was more compact. There were 2 entrances with a large gas-proof chamber between them. On the right, a short staircase led up to the arms room, with an ammunition bunker attached, and another 37 feet square beyond that. A second arms room, nearly 99 feet square, was sited at the rear. The approaches to the pillbox were protected by minefields, booby traps and barbed wire. The remainder of the accommodation consisted of troop quarters. The first of them was 190 feet square, and the second, measuring 81 feet square, had a locker attached. These pillboxes were like miniature fortresses in their own right, and in March 1945, one of them managed to hold up a division 15,000 strong for several hours. Explosive charges laid against the steel door blew a few holes, but the door failed to yield. It was only when grenades were tossed inside through the holes in the door that the stubborn strongpoint was finally overcome. Colonel Charles Buck Lanham was commander of the 22nd Regiment, the 4th Division of General Patton's 3rd Army, stationed in the Eifel Plateau region of western Germany. On the 13th of September 1944, Lanham informed his battalion officers of a plan for assaulting the West Wall that was simple, straightforward, and, he felt confident, was going to work. 3 battalions would attack the West Wall pillboxes, sited on the Black Man, the heights above the hamlet of Boucher, then move on to the pillboxes at the small village of Brandschied. The 3rd Battalion was to go in first, break through the wall, and open the way for 2 further battalions to follow and complete the attack. After that, the entire 4th Division could surge through the wall and head for the Rhine. The 3rd Battalion, led by Lieutenant Colonel Teague, advanced towards the Black Man Heights, carefully using the terrain to keep out of sight of the West Wall defenders. Some of the Americans were carrying flamethrowers. Meanwhile, American artillery was blasting the German positions. At first, there was no reaction from the West Wall. The Germans were evidently waiting for the right moment. When it came, it was devastating. Mortar fire plunged down on the 3rd Battalion, and the Germans' MG-42s began to clatter out streams of bullets. Americans keeled over one after the other until they lay in a pattern of patches on the hillside. Before long, the wounded were being dragged down the hill and back to the regiment's positions. All around, the cry went up for the medics. At length, Colonel Lanham realized that his men were on the brink of losing the battle. He drew his pistol and fired a couple of shots in the air, yelling at his reserves to get up and go. Eventually, they went, picking their way around the bodies still lying on the slopes. Lanham's plan proceeded, despite the ferocity of the German fightback. The 3rd Battalion moved south to Brandschied, but it was no sleepy little village. Unknown to Lanham or Teague, the place was spiked all around with pillboxes. A tough German battle group, Kampfgruppe Körner, was there, together with SS troops, to dismiss the American efforts with a furore of fire. Teague decided to dig in and try again the next day. The 3rd Battalion went on trying for another 2 weeks, but they got nowhere. The 22nd Regiment, meanwhile, attempted another approach, reducing the German bunkers one by one. This was no small enterprise, and at first the Americans tried to get the Germans to surrender. When they refused, tank destroyers were driven up to the steel doors and blasted them in at point-blank range. It was a dangerous maneuver for the attackers, but it worked. The survivors emerged, most of them badly injured. The dead were piled up inside. Before long, American casualties had mounted to 800 men, some of them killed when the Germans launched a counterattack out of their pillboxes. Half of the 1st Battalion were killed or injured, and only 2 of their officers survived. Many casualties were physically uninjured, but developed combat fatigue. Eventually, Colonel Lanham was forced to call off the attack as the weather worsened and the German defences showed no signs of lessening. Nothing had been gained, and the vital roads leading out of the Eifel region to the Rhine remained under German control. The wall remained intact. The next attempt at the West Wall was made from the Duchy of Luxembourg by the US 28th Infantry Bloody Bucket Division belonging to Courtney Hodges' 1st Army. The division's reputation for record casualties was furthered at the West Wall, where they were facing a crack force, the 2nd SS Division. As the Americans advanced across the minefields, the Germans saturated the battlefield with mortar and machine gun fire. Within a week, American casualties had reached 1,500 killed and injured. One entire company, F Company, disappeared so completely that no trace was ever found of them. Despite this fearsome defense, the Bloody Bucket Division pushed forward on a narrow front and captured several high points. But these were of little use to them when the 2nd SS Division still held the low ground. Even so, on the 16th of September, the Bloody Bucket scored a notable first. In what the official history described as a pencil-like penetration, they had breached the West Wall. In practical terms, it meant little. The disappearance of F Company had taken the heart out of the Americans' efforts, and they were ordered to wind up operations. A further attempt at the West Wall, made soon afterwards by the 5th Armoured Victory Division, managed to get through the fortifications to a position 6 miles inside German territory. But this initiative led to a mammoth German counterattack, overseen by Field Marshal von Rundstedt himself. Outnumbered, assaulted on both flanks by German infantry and armour, denied air cover when the weather turned nasty, the Victory Division began to falter. On the 19th and 20th of September, they were ordered to pull back. Pencil-thin penetrations were of no interest to General George Patton, commander of the 3rd Army, as he told newspaper reporters, "I'm going to go through the wall like shit through a goose." By the 5th of September, Patton's enforced halt at the River Meuse came to an end, as supplies of fuel to the Third Army began to flow again. Patton ordered the 12th and 20th Corps to seize the city of Nancy, the capital of Lorraine, as a prelude to breaking through the West Wall and crossing the Rhine. Patton envisaged no serious difficulty. The section of the West Wall immediately facing the Third Army was manned by 7 weak infantry divisions and a panzer brigade of the German First Army. Also in the vicinity were 7 under-strength divisions of the German 19th Army. Hardly an impressive opposition. However, even with this poor showing, this was one of the best defended parts of the West Wall, and Field Marshal Mödel, Hitler's fireman, was in overall charge. Elements of the Third Army set out for the Mosel River close to Nancy on the 11th of September. The Americans crossed the river, and though there was some heavy German resistance, it did not seriously impede their progress. Nancy was duly occupied on the 15th of September. At this juncture, the Americans had to halt for 4 days through lack of supplies and provisions, and the onset of bad weather. The delay gave the Germans the opportunity to regroup and concentrate reserves from their First Army at Château Salins, where they blocked one of the main routes to the Rhine. This meant the Americans had lost the initiative, and the 5th Panzer Army hit them with a series of major strikes at Patton's 4th Armoured Division. The contest continued for 10 days and took on a regular pattern. The Germans attacked under cover of fog and fought a series of vigorous engagements with the Americans. The Americans, who were aided, weather permitting, by aircraft of the 18th Tactical Air Command, outmaneuvered the panzers and forced them to withdraw. Finally, wrecked panzers littered the battle area, and the Germans were down to only 25 tanks. Wisely, they withdrew. In all, they'd lost around 280 tanks and suffered 3,000 casualties, with the same number taken prisoner. American losses were fewer, 626 casualties, but almost non-stop fighting over the past 2 months had exhausted them. They were retired from the Lorraine area on the 12th of October to rest, recoup, and refit. The West Wall remained untouched. Nine days later, to his chagrin, Patton lost the honor of making the first permanent breach in the fortifications. It happened at Aachen, a historic city on the German border with Belgium and the Netherlands. Aachen was fortified, but its defences were not unusually strong, and though it formed part of the West Wall, its position was of no strategic significance. Nevertheless, the capture of Aachen, the first appreciable city the Allies had encountered on German soil, could prove an important boost to morale. Dealing with Aachen fell to Courtney Hodges' First Army. Hodges' plan was to break through the West Wall north and south of the city, surround and neutralize it, while the bulk of his forces pushed on eastwards towards the Rhine. However, German resistance was so ferocious that it became impossible for the First Army to perform these 2 tasks at once. Hodges had to choose, and he chose to assault Aachen. The units originally intended for the Rhine were to play a backup role and prevent the Germans from relieving the city. Adolf Hitler fully realized the importance of Aachen and issued his usual orders to the 5,000 Germans defending it. Fight to the last man, never retreat, and die if necessary. The casualties that resulted from such fanatical defense had already proved so high that Hodges attempted to cut short the proceedings. He issued a surrender ultimatum on the 10th of October. As he no doubt expected, it was refused. Hodges now ordered his forces to attack. They were to demarcate the battle area by artillery and mortar fire, dominate the main thoroughfares and intersections with machine guns, and move infantry, tanks and tank destroyers along the side streets. All the while they would maintain maximum fire to ensure that no German could escape. While the defenders were being held in thrall in this fashion, buildings would be collapsing all around them, and it would bury them in the ruins. The initial bombardment of Aachen was delivered by 12 artillery battalions, which plastered the city with 10,000 rounds in 2 days. Meanwhile, fighter bombers of the 9th Tactical Artillery Command dropped over 160 tons of bombs on the target in the same period. By noon, heavy fighting was taking place inside Aachen. Nevertheless, by the end of the day, the Americans were ready to blast their way through to the city center. It was not that easy. For the next week, Aachen saw a ferocious struggle as the American tanks and tank destroyers hammered away with heavy caliber fire, using the powerful 155mm artillery pieces to blow entire buildings apart. The 155mm worked on the Germans like a terror weapon. Later, the German commander in Aachen, Colonel Gerhard Wilk, condemned it as barbarous and called for it to be banned. Lieutenant Colonel Darrell Daniel, commander of the 2nd Battalion, had quite another description for the 155mm, quite spectacular and satisfying. By the afternoon of the 21st of October, Daniel's 2nd Battalion had secured the business areas of Aachen and were pushing westwards when they learned the fight was over. Contrary to Hitler's orders, the garrison of Aachen had surrendered. The Americans captured 1,000 prisoners. According to their own reports, the Germans had suffered around 5,000 casualties. Quite probably, a lot more men were killed. The Americans lost around 1/10 of that number, most of them among the assault troops. After the battle, only around 20% of Aachen's buildings were left standing. Even before the capture of Aachen, the 9th Infantry Division of Hodge's 1st Army was ordered into the Hürten Forest, southeast of the city, to clear it as security for the right flank of another effort against the West Wall, a major assault across open country aimed at penetrating the fortifications. The Hürten was a man-made forest around 200 square miles. There were few roads. It was difficult fighting country, certainly for tanks and armored vehicles, and the Americans expected only light resistance. They were wrong. Although the German 7th Army was not well prepared to defend the forest, once the Americans entered, they fought with their customary ferocity to keep them back. By October, the 9th Airborne Division had suffered 4,500 casualties, for an advance of less than 2 miles. The battle in the forest now took on the proportions of a major struggle, and one in which the Germans always seemed to be one jump ahead. In November, Hodges ordered the 28th Bloody Bucket Infantry Division to advance through the forest to seize the high ground at Schmidt. Schmidt lay north of the important dams on the River Ruhr. Rain and fog intervened to cause delays, giving the Germans time to target the invasion. During the subsequent fighting, the Americans lost 6,000 casualties in one of the most costly actions of any they fought in the war. An action initially intended to be an easy ride had quickly turned into a nightmare. The forest floor was thickly sown with anti-personnel mines. Shells bursting high in the treetops fell down in showers of deadly metal fragments, onto soldiers picking their way through a mess of broken branches and slippery leaves. As the winter wore on, there was rain, mud, sleet, and snow. It was all too easy to get lost in the tangle of trees and stumble into ambushes. The German defense, ferocious as always, had an extra specific purpose. The top-secret Watch on the Rhine, the deliberately misnamed offensive due to take place in the Ardennes in December, could have been jeopardized if the Americans managed to cross the River Ruhr, which ran through the forest. The Ruhr itself was of great importance to the Germans. If the Americans crossed the river, now or in the future, they could be isolated by floods caused by opening the Ruhr dams. Ideally, the flooding might prevent them crossing at all. The cost on both sides was very high. By mid-October, the Germans had lost around 2,000 killed and injured, and 1,200 taken prisoners. American losses were even greater, 4,500 men killed, wounded, or missing. November 1944 went on as September and October had begun. Massive American assaults, accompanied by fighter-bomber attacks, did nothing to break down the German resistance, which was so powerful that the Bloody Bucket Division lost 40% of its strength in 7 days. On the 15th of November, 1,200 flying fortresses of the US Army 8th Air Force flew from the Netherlands to soften up the enemy for the US 84th Division at Geilenkirchen, north of Aachen. But the result was the same, a fearful battle of attrition in which the infantry suffered so many losses they were unable to continue. By December 1944, the Americans had been dashing themselves against the West Wall for 3 months, and despite the victory at Aachen, they were getting nowhere. The Hürten Forest became a microcosm of this failure. After the Bloody Bucket Division was withdrawn, another armoured division and 4 more infantry divisions were sent in, only to be shredded in their turn. None of them lasted more than 2 weeks before they were replaced by the next. The ultimate responsibility for breaking this impasse lay with General Eisenhower. After such a long time, so many losses and so many failures, he might well have felt that his job was on the line. Even worse, the outcome of the war could be in the balance. Inside their defenses, the Germans had proved too strong to shift. Instead, Eisenhower sought to lure them out of their fortifications so the Americans could meet them on open ground, where they had a better chance to prevail. Eisenhower laid a trap, the so-called Ghost Front in the Ardennes, where the American defenses were thin and the Germans might fancy their chances of success. In fact, Eisenhower had 14 armoured divisions waiting in the wings to fall on them once they emerged. In the meantime, the frontal attacks on the wall continued. There was no major breakthrough, but there were some gains. The Americans captured the important crossroads leading to the defences in the Hürten Forest and the Wallerscheid crossroads north of Monschau. The west wall itself was penetrated to a depth of 1,200 yards. On the 16th of December 1944, the Germans appeared to fall for Eisenhower's trap. They came out of their fortifications, but not to assault the Americans with their understrength manpower. In one of the worst cases of bad luck coincidence in military history, Eisenhower's trap was preempted by the Ardennes offensive, the last gasp initiative by 24 German divisions to throw back the Allies and possibly win the war. The Allies never imagined that at this late stage in the war the Germans were capable of mustering such a force. But the Ardennes offensive did not last long. After initial successes, fuel supplies ran out. and in early January 1945, it was all over. On the 16th of January 1945, 8 days after the end of the Ardennes offensive, British forces under Bernard Montgomery, now a field marshal, took their turn at cracking the West Wall. Their target was the Heinsberg salient, around 20 miles long, which was defended by 3 lines of fortifications, continuous trenches and weapons pits covered by barbed wire and liberally sown with mines. The Germans had 2 infantry divisions in the salient, with 156 guns and 18 assault guns, all of them spread over muddy terrain that was difficult and dangerous to traverse. Montgomery's forces consisted of 2 infantry divisions, the 43rd and the 52nd Lowland Division, and the very tough, very hardy 1st Commando Brigade. US General Patton was not at all happy about the prospect of Montgomery, his hated rival, gaining the honor of being the first to reach the Rhine. At the end of January 1945, Patton, with help from General Bradley, persuaded Eisenhower to agree to an armored reconnaissance in the Eifel region that would take his forces across the rivers Our and Sauer to close in on the West Wall. The term armored reconnaissance was somewhat vague, and Patton preferred it that way. For him, it was a means to an end. Patton wasn't planning a reconnaissance at all. He aimed to get his Third Army so committed to the battle at the West Wall that Eisenhower would have to agree to their participation. The guns of Patton's Third Army opened up on the morning of the 29th of January 1945 and began pounding the fortifications. The weather was foul. It began to snow as the assault battalion of the 4th Infantry began to advance. They slid across the frozen Our River and then blasted their way through Brandschied with artillery, tank fire, and flamethrowers. The Germans fought back, but in the ferocious hand-to-hand fighting that ensued, they were pushed back. Although they managed to win back the village of Brandschied, there'd been a partial breakthrough of the West Wall near the town of Prüm. By this time, Patton had expected confirmation from Eisenhower to proceed towards Mosul. When contact was eventually made, Patton was infuriated to be told that the Third Army must stay put, go on the defensive, and await further orders. Orders, when they came through, were not of much comfort to Patton. The hated Montgomery had received sanction for 14 British divisions to begin a fresh attack against the Norman positions on the West Wall, starting on the 10th of February. All Patton was allowed to do was continue operations in the Eifel region until that date. After Montgomery's attack went in, Patton turned to making preparations for a separate assault by his Third Army on the center of the West Wall. But attempts at preserving the element of surprise suffered setbacks. The Germans suspected that something big was afoot, and they were certain of it when the Third Army suddenly imposed radio silence. At 0100 hours on the 7th of February 1945, Patton's artillery, including 155mm guns, began roaring out shells towards the German positions across the River Sauer. Under cover of this bombardment, men of the Third Army's 12th Corps set out across the river in 36 rubber boats, formerly belonging to the German Luftwaffe. They ran into a massive blast of German fire, which only one of the boats survived. But a sufficient number of Americans managed to reach the other side of the river to form up and mount attacks on the West Wall pillboxes. This time, the Americans attacked them from the rear, the only way of tackling them that offered a real chance of success. The result was a series of blackened, blasted back doors, and crews so shocked at the suddenness of the onslaught that many of them panicked and surrendered. For the next week, the Americans continued destroying pillboxes, 40 of them to each square mile. But the breaching of the West Wall in the Eifel region was only a local success. the fortifications running from Trier on the Mosel down to the Swiss border were still intact. Patton, unwilling to lose the momentum, wanted to continue his attack, cross the river Mosel and assault Trier, then drive on through to the Rhine. The Third Army did in fact capture Trier on the 1st of March, after a very stiff fight lasting 3 days, but the rest of Patton's plan did not accord with official strategy. Montgomery's assault in the Reichswald forest still had priority. Unfortunately, his campaign had degenerated into a grim slogging match. Although his British and Canadian forces had succeeded in breaking through the West Wall to the north, more than 15,600 men had been lost, and the end of February arrived before the struggle showed signs of ending. If eventually Montgomery's forces were to attack across the Rhine into the industrial region of the Ruhr, it would have to be on a narrow front. This enabled General Omar Bradley, whose interests were much the same as Patton's, to propose a backup position for the American forces. The First and Third Armies would advance to the Rhine before Montgomery made his attempt at a crossing. What Bradley was really doing was seeing to it that American troops were in a position to be first across the Rhine and first to spill out into the rest of Germany. During the assault on the River Sauer, the 4th Armoured Division of Patton's Third Army advanced on Bitburg, which they meant to use as a springboard for their own drive to the Rhine. By the 5th of March, the Allied assaults on the West Wall during the previous few days had opened the way for them. They left Bitburg, and 2 days later, on the 7th of March, the division's lead tanks reached the Rhine. The same morning, the US 9th Armoured Division of Hodge's First Army arrived at the Ludendorff railway bridge at Remagen, just as German engineers were preparing to blow it up. The Germans exploded some of their charges, but the bridge survived long enough for American infantry to cross the Rhine and establish the first Allied bridgehead on the other side. 10 days later, the bridge at Remagen collapsed into the river. Although much of the West Wall remained in German hands, it had failed in its prime purpose, to keep the Allies out of Germany. The Allied drive to the Rhine had effectively bypassed the fortifications and made them redundant once again. On the 20th of March, the 9th Armoured Division made a final assault on the West Wall. The Americans approached warily, expecting the pillboxes to explode with fire. There was none. The pillboxes were empty. Most of the defenders had gone. Some remained at their posts and surrendered. Others fled under cover of darkness. A few ransacked the ruins of houses for clothes, assumed civilian guise, and kept on running. Once the Allied forces were across the Rhine, it was only a matter of time before the Third Reich collapsed. This did not prevent the Germans from fighting on, and another 2 months passed after the crossing of the Rhine at Remagen before their surrender on the 7th of May 1945. By then, the West Wall had played its part in deciding the new shape of Europe and the nature of post-war politics. But the way in which it was finally overcome did not arise from purely military considerations. The Low Countries and northern Germany had come under Montgomery's overall command, so that taking this route to invade the Third Reich, as envisaged before D-Day, would have brought American forces under British control. However, the American generals were too chauvinistic to stand for that. This applied particularly to General Patton, whose name for Montgomery was unprintable, and to a lesser extent to General Bradley. To Patton, the idea that his hated rival might be the first to reach the Rhine was anathema. As for General Bradley, he had his own secret agenda in February 1945, when he suggested that Hodges' First Army and Patton's Third Army should mass at the Rhine to cover Montgomery's narrow front thrust across the river. This was important insurance against the Germans staging another Ardennes-style offensive. But it was no coincidence that it also made sure that the Rhine crossing would be an all-American enterprise. General Patton had made his own contribution to this state of affairs. By turning his aggressive defense at the West Wall into an aggressive offense, he drew the focus of American operations southwards. This was the wrong position for a speedy drive to Berlin, and meanwhile the Russians gained the time to move in from the east and reach the German capital first. Subsequently, this enabled them to claim for communism a larger share of Europe than the British and the Americans meant them to have. And for the next 45 years, until communism collapsed in Europe and the Cold War came to an end, the world had to live with the consequences.
As the German advance into northern Russia continued, the rail link to Leningrad was cut. The fate of Leningrad, and with it 30 Russian divisions, appeared to be sealed. The next stage of the battle was expected to be an attack on the beleaguered city. Contrary to their own expectations, the men of the German 18th Army were not to be asked to mount a full-scale attack on the city, and after a series of hotly contested battles for the outskirts, Hitler uncharacteristically ordered his troops to take Leningrad by means of a long drawn-out siege. It has been suggested that he was unnerved by the remote-controlled explosions which the Russians had used so effectively in Kiev. It is a decision which still provokes debate today. There are really two possible explanations for the failure of Army Group North to take Leningrad. One was the conflicting priorities in the mind of Adolf Hitler and the Army High Command. Hitler vacillated between prioritizing a number of objectives. There is also a school of thought which favours Hitler's adverse reaction to the huge losses of the German 6th Army in Kiev in August and September. In Kiev, thousands of German troops were lost to remote-controlled explosions, and thousands of others to desperate street fighting. This, it is thought, persuaded Hitler that no German troops should be made vulnerable by committing them to the inner city streets of Moscow and Leningrad. In any event, the 18th Army lacked the really heavy artillery necessary to reduce the defences of Leningrad. The massive guns of the German siege train had already been allocated to the sector of Army Group South, where they were earmarked for the coming battles in the Crimea. To move them all the way across Russia would have delayed the operation into winter. To compound the problems of the battles for the attackers, Panzer Group 4 was withdrawn from Army Group North in late September 1941 in order to support Army Group Center in Operation Typhoon, the final drive on Moscow. No German army group could afford to lose its tanks, but Army Group North lost virtually all of its armor. The withdrawal of the tanks from Army Group North meant that the army was virtually immobile. It was to remain so for almost 3 years. It is easy to suggest that the loss of Panzer Group 4 in September 1941 was directly responsible for the failure of Army Group North to take its strategic objective of Leningrad. However, this is by no means certain. The capture of a city as large and well defended as Leningrad was by no means certain, even with a strong armoured force. Nevertheless, the removal of Panzer Group 4 clearly did not help the cause of Army Group North. It meant that Army Group North would be denied this one formation and the size, speed and fighting power to advance quickly into the regions beyond the city of Leningrad, link up with the Finns and effectively cut off the city from its supplies. The disappearance of Panzer Group 4 proved to be a forerunner of things to come. From that point onwards, the evidence was clear that of the 3 German army groups, Army Group North was considered to be the poor relation. It soon became obvious that they could expect to receive no substantial additional support of any kind, and the artillery siege train would never be sent to Leningrad. The 18th Army therefore had no alternative but to take Leningrad by siege. It seemed that the decisive battles on the Eastern Front would be fought elsewhere. With the commencement of the siege of Leningrad, a relatively stable front line appeared in the northern sector. The 16th Army fought on the right flank of the northern sector, where it was adjacent to the left wing of Army Group Center. The 18th Army fought on the left flank of the 16th Army, and as such formed the extreme northern end of the front line. Army Group North was to remain doggedly committed to the northern flank of the German armies fighting on the Eastern Front for the entire duration of the war. The siege of Leningrad was the stage for an intense struggle that would in later years be recognized as a key event in that conflict of inhuman savagery. The opening stages were bitterly fought in the suburbs of the city. When General Zhukov arrived to take over the defense of the city on the 10th of September 1941, he found the defenders in an advanced state of disorganization and the inhabitants close to panic. Undaunted, he briskly set about bolstering its defenses. A shortage of anti-tank guns was dealt with by converting anti-aircraft artillery to the task of attempting to halt the panzers. 6 brigades of naval infantry and students were formed, and reinforcements drafted in from the Karelian Isthmus. Zhukov began to take the fight to the Germans through raids and counterattacks. But by now, the German troops had pierced the inner circle of defences and were rampaging through the suburbs. After a furious exchange of advances and retreats, by the end of the month, the defenders were hanging onto their city by their fingernails. It seemed inevitable that Leningrad would capitulate. But as Zhukov awaited a renewed assault, the 4th Panzer Group suddenly departed to join the battle for Moscow, and the remaining German forces began to build defences. Hitler had decreed that Leningrad would not be taken by force. It would instead be starved into submission. But there was a flaw in the plan. Although the supply situation was difficult without Panzer Group 4, the ring around the city was never completely closed. It was still possible to reach the city over land, through the virgin forests of the Russian motherland. It was also possible to bring in supplies by boat across the waters of Lake Ladoga. In October, there was some temporary relief for the defenders. The roads had disintegrated into canals of bottomless mud, along which wheeled vehicles could drive only at a snail's pace, and only if they were towed by tanks. This was the Rasputitsa, the season of mud, which came as a debilitating surprise to the Germans in 1941. General Rauss went to great lengths after the war to explain the great significance of the muddy season. German losses of tanks and motorized equipment of all types were extraordinarily high during the autumn muddy period of 1941, the first time that the mud of Russia was encountered. A division of the 4th Panzer Group, operating in the area north of Gzhatsk during the same period, lost 50 tanks without a shot being fired, 35 of them within 3 days. These losses were extremely serious, since no replacements were received. The Germans had no conception of mud as it exists in European Russia. In the autumn of 1941, when frontline troops were already stuck fast, the German High Command still believed that mud could be conquered by brute force, an idea that led to serious losses of vehicles and equipment. At the height of the muddy season, tractors and recovery vehicles, normally capable of traversing difficult terrain, are helpless, and attempts to plough through the muddy mass makes roads even more impassable. Tanks, heavy recovery vehicles, and even vehicles with good ground clearance simply pushed an ever-growing wall of mud before them until they finally stopped, half buried by their own motion. A sudden frost in the autumn of 1941 cemented a crippled, buried column into a state of complete uselessness, and it never moved again. Because it could not be reached in any other way, Gasoline, tow ropes, and food supplies were airdropped along the line of stranded armor, but all attempts to move were futile. Often, when drivers found themselves bogged down far from any habitation, they abandoned their vehicles and set out on foot to contact friendly troops in the nearest village, or sought food and shelter from local civilians in order to remain alive until the worst of the muddy season passed. For the muddy seasons, vehicles with high ground clearance, lightweight, and low unit ground pressure were necessary. German trucks had low ground clearance and could not get traction in deep mud. Since German supply cars had wheels too narrow for muddy terrain, they sank deep into soft ground. Even the German Motier and Ostschlepper of the later years were bogged down in mud as their tracks were too narrow. Rouse noted that the awkward-looking and slow Russian tractor of pre-war vintage salvaged the heaviest, most deeply mired loads after German equipment failed to budge them. Inside Leningrad, food supplies to the besieged city had been diminishing throughout the autumn. By late November, they were at their lowest ebb for the entire duration of the siege. Manual workers were receiving only 250 grams of bread per day, 1/3 of their normal requirement. Without water for sanitation and basic medical supplies, disease became inevitable. As winter arrived and temperatures fell to the -20s, thousands began to die each day. Total starvation threatened constantly. To the Germans, collapse seemed imminent. Back in Berlin, a reception with Adolf Hitler as a guest of honor was organized to celebrate the fall of the stricken city. The invitations were printed, but never posted. Russian resistance remained stubborn and defiant. Even women soldiers in the Red Army were in combat units. The ferocity and inhumanity of the conflict beggars the imagination. In an attempt to relieve the appalling conditions in the city, the Russians marked a road across the frozen southwest corner of Lake Ladoga, and by the 22nd of November, convoys of supply lorries were just managing to stave off famine in the city. It was a hazardous passage through the biting northeastern gales which swept across the lake. The German Luftwaffe also did its best to intercept the convoys and break the surface of the ice. Yet for all its horror, the Russians knew that defending this lifeline to the city was the only possible way of keeping the inhabitants alive. but for some, the food coming across the ice was too little, too late. Victims of starvation, suffering from falling blood pressure and the wasting of the heart and internal organs, would never regain their health. Many would die months after food and medical supplies finally arrived. The children who survived would emerge totally traumatized by the siege, as an eyewitness recalled. It was reflected in the way many of the children played, all by themselves, in the way that even in their collective games they played in silence, with grave faces. I saw faces of children which reflected such thoughtfulness and sorrow that those eyes and faces told one more than could be gathered from all the stories of the horrors of famine. As events unfolded, it soon became clear that in spite of all the hardships of the siege of Leningrad, the northern sector was considered by both sides to be of secondary importance. The men of Army Group North soon became convinced that they were fighting what they referred to as the eternal war of the poor man. Casualties along the whole of the Russian front had been enormous, but only 67,000 replacements were allocated to Army Group North, as against 131,000 to Army Group Centre and 119,000 to Army Group South. When it came to allocating fresh divisions from the reserves, the situation was even less favourable. Of 21 new divisions released by Army High Command in the autumn of 1941, only 3 were allocated to Army Group North. It was a further indication of things to come. One unexpected benefit for the Army Group was the occasional support which they received from German naval units operating in the Baltic. As one flank rested on the Baltic seas, Army Group North was the only formation which could look for substantial support from the Kriegsmarine. The German Navy had played a significant role in the Soviet-German War. In the Baltic, the Germans sealed up the powerful Russian front with minefields. By doing so, they also trapped the Soviet submarine fleet. As the Germans advanced along the Baltic coastline, they took control of Russian bases, so that the Soviet Baltic fleet had to remain bottled up in Leningrad. The function of the Soviet Baltic Fleet during 1941 and 42 was limited solely to supplying fire support to the Soviet forces fighting to defend the city. This aspect of the fighting was also to provide the stage for a daring attack led by the Stukas of Heinz Ulrich Rudel. The Luftwaffe was ordered to sink the Soviet battleship Marat. Rudel managed this amazing feat in the face of fierce anti-aircraft fire with a single, well-placed bomb. On the deficit side, the 18th Army had to become involved in a number of amphibious operations to capture the Baltic Islands, which placed a great strain on what were already severely limited resources. Throughout the whole course of the war, the lack of powerful reinforcements severely limited the strategic options available for the Army Group Command. It also required a great deal of juggling of available divisions to maintain the extended front line and the siege of Leningrad, which was to drag on for almost 3 years. The Germans had closed right up on the city and into the outer suburbs, but the ring was not closed. An important consideration at this time was the role of the Finns. They agreed to move close to Leningrad, their 5th General Mannerheim making it quite clear that he was prepared to take action to recover Finnish territory yielded to Russia in the Winter War of 1939, but that he would not take part in the direct attack on Leningrad itself. That was one of the conditions Finland made on entering the war against Russia on the side of the Germans. Mannerheim was as mindful of the political conditions as he was of the military conditions, because of Finland's vulnerability to future Russian aggression. This meant that the German and Finnish armies were never able to cut off Leningrad completely from the rest of the world. In both winter and summer, the Russian forces were still able to get resources across Lake Ladoga in the northeast of the city. From the winter of 1942 onwards, the railway to the east of Leningrad was completed, and Leningrad was connected to the rest of the Soviet Union, which enabled the forces to supply the inhabitants of the city, helping some of them to survive the siege. The Soviet negotiators in the Soviet-Finnish peace talks, which took place in 1944, actually recalled that the Russians recognized what the Finns had done for them. If the Finns had moved forward and closed the ring of siege around Leningrad, it would have meant the death of the city. Despite the fact that some supplies got through, it was precious little. Starvation drove the population to extreme measures, including the horrifying excess of cannibalism. The first cases occurred at the beginning of December 1941. The Soviet Criminal Code made no mention of such a crime as cannibalism. So Soviet officials could at first only define it as an extreme form of banditry. According to the top-secret report of the military procurator of Leningrad, A.A. Kuznetsov, dated 27th of February 1942, investigations of cannibalism led to criminal charges against 26 individuals in December 1941, 366 in January 1942, and 494 in the first 2 weeks of February 1942. Investigation revealed that not only was human flesh consumed by individuals, but it was also sold to other citizens. By the 20th of February 1942, 866 individuals were under criminal investigation or actual indictment for suspected cannibalism. Only 18% of this number had any previous criminal record. Of the 886 suspect individuals, 322 were men and 564 women. Almost 30% were aged over 40, the next largest group being in their 30s. More ghoulish still was the discovery of extensive intrusions into cemeteries and the mutilation of the recent dead. One evening in March 1942, the watchman at the Bogoslovsky Cemetery detained a woman with a sack. Once opened, the sack revealed the bodies of 5 infants. The increase in cannibalism forced the city authorities to set up police guards at all the major cemeteries. With the first snows of 1941, came a cruelly bitter winter. The temperature continued to fall, and the German soldiers now paid dearly for the arrogance of the High Command that had refused to admit the possibility of anything other than a quick, decisive campaign. Few men in the German trenches had more than summer clothing, and frostbite took an agonizing toll. German machinery and guns had never been designed to function in such extremes. Engines seized up, metal tank tracks split apart in the cold, ammunition would not fire. The fierceness of the cold was far beyond the experience of most Germans. Emboldened by the problems they saw in the German ranks, a series of Soviet counterattacks managed to roll back many of the German gains around Leningrad. With incredible exertions, the Germans kept up a semblance of defense. The tactics of winter warfare centered around contests for the possession of roads and inhabited places. In Russia, villages and roads were infinitely more important than they were on the rest of the continent. In other German theatres of war, no one particular road ever became a crucial factor, since a well-developed road network always offered a choice of alternate routes. In Russia, the possession of a single road was often a matter of life or death for an entire army. The extreme tactical importance of inhabited places during the 6 months of winter explains the fact that the Russians would frequently much rather destroy them than surrender them to the enemy. In the bitter trench warfare outside Leningrad, the defender had a definite advantage in winter because, as a rule, their positions could not be seen in the snow, except at very close range. The defenders were able to keep their forces under cover and wait until the moment their fire could be used most effectively. The attacker was also impeded and easily detected, even in camouflage clothing. The principal weapon of the defender became the machine gun, as its performance was not diminished by snow, in which mortars and light artillery lost most of their effectiveness. Replacements were also becoming a problem for the German forces. After the war, it became clear from the diaries of Army Group North that the commanders of both formations had intentionally prohibited, even during calm periods, the removal of a unit from the front in order to grant it a period of rest. It was better to keep the divisions at the front and assign them to a narrower sector, as otherwise a reserve unit which had been removed from the northern front was certain to be taken by the Supreme Command and assigned more pressing pressure points on either the central or the southern front. Although the northern front was regarded as being of secondary importance, it was in no sense a backwater. There was still a great deal of terrible fighting in very difficult terrain, with extensive swamps and few roads through the vast sections of trackless forest, which presented a logistical nightmare. Army Group North and the Army divisions were facing the most difficult conditions on the Eastern Front. The climate and the terrain were completely different. Around Leningrad, it is very marshy and boggy. There were also very few roads, so all transport logistics were very difficult indeed. To compound the difficulties for the Germans, by October of 1941, the first partisan attacks had begun to cause severe difficulties in the rear areas. The effects of these attacks were further compounded by the fact that the underdeveloped infrastructure of Russia meant that there were very few roads or railways which could be used as alternatives to those blocked by partisan activity. The Russian winter was a nightmare along the whole of the front, but it was Army Group North which bore the brunt of the most extreme Russian winters. It is impossible to exaggerate the cruel realities of fighting in the ferocious winters of northern Russia. In addition to their geographical and climactic difficulties, the fighting spirit of the Red Army facing Army Group North was no less intense than that displayed on the other sectors. The siege of Leningrad has become synonymous with endurance and suffering, but there was also a great deal of intense combat as a series of miniature battles rolled backwards and forwards around the siege lines outside Leningrad. Despite coming very close to victory on a number of occasions, Army Group North was never able to close the ring around Leningrad completely, and the High Command continued to draw desperately needed divisions away from the Army Group North sector in order to feed other hard-pressed sectors. The result of this attrition from two directions was that a ferocious Soviet offensive in January 1944 finally broke the resistance of Army Group North and raised the siege. The lifting of the siege of Leningrad in 1944 forced Army Group North to fall back to a new defensive front, composed of a series of partially constructed defences known as the Panther Line. This line should have represented a fallback position for the German forces, but work was beginning much too late. The Panther Line was envisaged as a series of strong fortifications incorporating parts of the northern regions of the Soviet Union in a line running southwards from Lake Dvina and Lake Pskov near the town of Narva on the Baltic coast of Estonia. It was envisaged that the German troops retreating behind the line would occupy a series of excellent defensive points. The German troops would therefore have a respite from the rigours of the retreat and be able to hold the Soviet army at bay. Meanwhile, the armoured formations and the air formations of the German army were repaired and returned to the fray to renew combat with their Soviet foes. However, the Panther Line was constructed merely as an afterthought when it was much too late. The German armies had suffered defeats and simply did not have enough troops to man the line effectively. In those areas where adequate defences had been prepared in the line and there were sufficient German troops and aircraft available, it proved a very formidable obstacle for the Soviet army to overcome. Had it been properly prepared, as part of a coherent overall strategic plan, the Panther Line could have been held. The Panther Line was only ever going to provide a temporary solution to the mounting problems of Army Group North. The destruction of the neighbouring army group's centre in June 1944 tore a huge gap in the German lines and left the right flank of Army Group North vulnerable to a Soviet attack. Hitler was forced to sanction another series of withdrawals. From the Panther Line, Army Group North were forced to retreat in relatively good order towards Germany, fighting a series of ferocious defensive battles as they went, the most notable of these being the defence of Narva in 1944. The battle for Narva plays a very important part in the Soviet-German war because Narva is the gateway to Estonia. The Germans recognized the importance of holding Narva, and there were initially 12 divisions organized into what was called Abteilung Narva, a special force grouping which was to fight with enormous courage and distinction. The defence of Narva was a bitterly fought encounter. A breakthrough here would have compromised many German troops in the Baltic regions of Estonia and Latvia. European SS, along with the German regular army divisions, managed to hold back the forces of the Soviet Leningrad front throughout January, February and March. Their bitter attritional contest was not characterized by sophisticated tactical maneuvers. It was a bloody slugging match. The German formations were saved by the early spring thaw of late March 1944, which produced seas of mud floods of at least 1 foot deep in an area of 100 to 140 miles square. Even Soviet tanks stuck fast in the torrents of mud, and the German forces were able to retreat once more. The incredible resistance offered by Army Group Narva, a scratch formation drawn from the slender resources of Army Group North, represents an impressive example of military improvisation and stands comparison with the other German defensive battles fought elsewhere in Russia and Italy. The mainstay of resistance in Narva was the 3rd SS Panzer Corps, which included the long-serving SS Police Division along with the new SS Viking Division, comprised of volunteers from different nationalities. By October 1944, the situation around Narva from a German point of view was hopeless. But unlike the countless garrisons squandered by Hitler in a pointless series of hold-at-all-costs orders, Army Group Narva managed to escape and rejoin Army Group North. Constant retreat was now the order of the day, as the Army Group was driven back through the Baltic states towards Germany. But Army Group North would never make it home. While the Red Army rolled on towards Berlin, the men of Army Group North were finally cornered in the Kurland peninsula of Latvia. There, the battered remnants of the Army Group held off all attacks by the Red Army for 6 long months. They were under siege from late October 1944 through to May 1945. In January 1945, the two armies which had served since 1941 as Army Group North were renamed Army Group Kurland. The hard-won mantle of Army Group North was transferred to a scratch assembly of beaten units, under the command of a swift succession of temporary leaders. The spirit of the men of Army Group North remained behind in Kurland. The German divisions which found their way to Kurland were stuck there. They were blockaded by the Russians, and there was nothing they could do. They could no longer make any useful contribution to the greater course of the war elsewhere. In many respects, it was a very wasteful and irresponsible gesture on the part of Hitler. This, albeit scratch army, was still a considerable force, which could have made a valuable contribution elsewhere, but it was not to be made available. Despite everything that the besieged Red Army could throw at them, the surviving elements of the 16th and 18th Armies, now officially known as Army Group Kurland, continued to resist all further attempts to force them into surrender. Fighting for the Kurland Peninsula was grinding in nature. It was not like the Western and Eastern fronts, characterized by large formations sweeping along the frontier in impressive, sophisticated operations. In the Kurland fighting, the Germans trapped in this region were gradually, slowly and surely pushed back in spectacular fashion into something of a geographical cul-de-sac by the Red Army. They were well served to the bitter end by the ships of the Kriegsmarine, who managed to evacuate some divisions recalled to Germany. On occasion, they even managed to bring in some much-needed reinforcements. The German Navy did have an important role to play when the Red Army began to advance along the Baltic coast to break into East Prussia. Because if at all possible, the German Navy had to try and contain Soviet naval operations. Even more importantly, they had a grievous burden to try and evacuate as many of the German civilians and German military units who had been trapped and transport them back into German territory. The naval aspect in the closing stage of the war does demonstrate that the German Navy could operate well, even in the face of disaster, which was now pending. The Kriegsmarine was absolutely vital in explaining why German formations fought bitterly to the end for the pointless battle for the Kurland Peninsula. The peninsula, from the Army's point of view, was militarily useless. Indeed, many German commanders in late 1944 and spring 1945 constantly requested Hitler to give up the Kurland Peninsula. This would release the 26 divisions that were fighting there, in order to bolster their defense in what were more important military regions nearer to home. The German Navy had used the Baltic Sea throughout World War II as a training ground for its submarine commanders. Dönitz, a committed Nazi who was in charge of the Navy at this stage, regarded the retention of the Gulf of Danzig in the Baltic Sea as essential in order to train his submarine commanders to use the extremely powerful new submarine, the Type 21, which the German Navy were developing towards the end of the war. The Kriegsmarine therefore played a critical role in explaining why the German formations fought so bitterly for the Kurland Peninsula. Trapped in Kurland, the survivors of the old Army Group North maintained their cohesion and fighting ability until the final surrender on May the 8th, 1945, almost 4 years since they had first moved into Russia. On that day, 203,000 men began the long march into Soviet captivity. Many would never return, and others were held as slave laborers until 1955, a high price to pay for their long defense. Of the 3 huge army groups which Hitler sent into Russia, it could be argued that Army Group North was the most successful in carrying out the tasks assigned to it. Although the campaign ultimately ended in failure for them, the men of Army Group North retained their military cohesion, with some units achieving the rare distinction of serving for the whole 4 years of the Russian war in the same army group. In the summer of 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched over a vast area of the Western Pacific. After the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, Japanese forces moved quickly to capture Hong Kong, Burma, Malaya, Borneo, the Philippines, and Singapore. By the spring of 1942, Japanese troops were in New Guinea as the expanding empire swept into the Solomon Islands. By the end of May, Japanese territory spread as far as the large jungle island that would give its name to one of the best-known episodes of the Pacific War, Guadalcanal. Japan's expansion was a seemingly relentless advance, but around the time they reached Guadalcanal, the tide was already beginning to turn against the empire. The May 1942 Battle of the Coral Sea forced Japan to shelve the idea of attacking New Guinea's capital, Port Moresby. In early June, the stunning American victory at Midway persuaded the Japanese leadership to halt their expansion into the Pacific. Consolidation was now the order of the day. But the empire was still a force to be reckoned with. In the middle of June 1942, Allied intelligence in the Solomon Islands reported a worrying development. The Japanese occupiers of Guadalcanal were constructing an airfield on the north coast of the island. Coconut trees were being felled in their thousands, and the reports suggested that the airstrip would be operational in a matter of weeks. This was serious news for the Allies. A Japanese air presence on Guadalcanal would threaten the precious supply line between Hawaii and Australia. In Washington, the American chiefs of staff considered their response. One idea was to carry out a raid against Guadalcanal and put the airfield out of commission. But eventually a plan was hatched that was far more bold in scope. Instead of merely raiding Guadalcanal, the Americans decided to capture the island. The plan was to effect an amphibious landing by American Marine forces, eject the small Japanese presence, and establish an Allied airbase on the island. By June the 25th, the decision was made to go ahead with the operation. Its code name, Watchtower. When the decision was made to capture Guadalcanal, the American planners knew very little about the background that lay ahead. The island was almost entirely unfamiliar. Maps were few and unreliable, and only a limited air reconnaissance was possible. And this was not the only problem that affected American preparations. The success of the Guadalcanal offensive would depend on the Marine troops, whose task was to go ashore and physically capture the vital airstrip. But when the Marine commander, General van der Grift, received his orders at his headquarters in New Zealand on the 25th of June, he knew that his men were far from combat ready. It was only in the previous month that the Marines had left their home base in North Carolina, and by the end of June, only a third of their number had arrived in New Zealand. General van der Grift had been told not to expect any operational duties until 1943. Now, his unprepared division was expected to go into battle in a matter of weeks. Van der Grift was forced into urgent preparations in New Zealand as his men and supplies arrived in the region. Despite an outbreak of influenza amongst his troops and the inconvenience of a strike amongst the dock workers in the port of Wellington, by the end of July, the Marine troops were in position on the island of Fiji, awaiting a final rehearsal for the task ahead. General van der Grift had by now secured a postponement of the day of attack from August the 1st to August the 7th. But he knew that his preparation time had been far from ideal, and in Fiji, the inexperience of the American Marines revealed itself. The Guadalcanal expedition would be an amphibious operation, quite unprecedented in size, and the Fiji exercise revealed the logistical difficulties involved. There was little evidence of coordination between the amphibious landing groups and the accompanying naval and air support. Equipment proved unreliable, and the whole exercise was judged to be little less than a farce. But there could be no delay in the timetable. August the 7th would be the date when the American plan would be put into action. The intentions of the American leadership for the Guadalcanal offensive were relatively straightforward. An armada of transport ships would sail from Fiji to the Solomon Islands and enter the channel to the north of Guadalcanal. There, the main amphibious force would take to their landing crafts and go ashore, while supporting units secured the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tamonbogo. The transport vessels would not be alone. Instead, they were just part of a much larger invasion force. To the north and northeast lay a substantial protective naval presence, under the command of Admiral Crutchley of the Royal Australian Navy. 5 cruisers and 9 destroyers. Generous air support was also provided. Some 100 miles to the south, an American carrier fleet formed into position. The value of the aircraft carrier had already been proved dramatically at the Coral Sea and at Midway, and so the carriers Saratoga, Wasp, and Enterprise were deployed to provide fighter support for the Guadalcanal offensive. Alongside the carriers, 1 battleship, 6 cruisers, and some 16 destroyers. These substantial resources were all deployed in support of Vandegrift's 1st Marine Division, a landing force reinforced with crack units of paratroops and Marine raiders. But nothing could hide the fact that the 1st Marine Division had only been formed recently, and that the majority of its men lacked any experience of battle. The American Marines could not be sure of the size of the force that awaited them on Guadalcanal, but they could guess at the strength of the Japanese fighting spirit. The best intelligence available suggested that a force of 7,000 troops were in position on the island, and these were likely to include soldiers with recent experience of fighting in difficult jungle conditions. By contrast, there were few men in the American Marines who had ever come across an environment like that of Guadalcanal. The Americans also knew that Japanese strength did not derive only from its positions at Guadalcanal itself. Somewhere to the northwest, in the vicinity of New Britain, lurked the might of Japanese naval power, the 4th Inner South Sea Fleet. These were the concerns that faced the American commanders on the eve of battle in early August 1942. In overall command of the Watchtower operation was Vice Admiral Robert Lee Gormley, a 57-year-old who had served as a liaison officer in London. Gormley arrived in New Zealand in March 1942 to take up command of the South Pacific area and South Pacific Force. Not long afterwards, he received the order to proceed with the Guadalcanal attack. But Gormley would not be in the South Pacific when the fighting finally ended. His eventual removal may have been the result of one of his decisions in the early days of the offensive. But in August 1942, Admiral Gormley was the man in charge. Amongst his subordinates, Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, known to his men as Black Jack. A veteran of the Battle of the Coral Sea and the Battle of Midway, Fletcher was seen as an ideal choice to command the naval task force on which the success of the Guadalcanal offensive would depend. But Fletcher's reputation would also be affected by the decision of his superior, Admiral Gormley. Once again, there was no such concern when operations began. Rear Admiral Fletcher's huge task force was divided into 2 groups, with the key amphibious force under the command of Rear Admiral Richmond J. Turner. Like Gormley and Fletcher, Turner was in his late 50s, although he had never seen active combat service. Instead, he was regarded as an authority in the business of planning an amphibious attack. At Guadalcanal, he would get the chance to put his theories into practice. Rear Admiral Turner's direct subordinates included Major General Alexander A. Vandegrift, and it was this Marine commander who would become most associated with the eventual outcome at Guadalcanal. A veteran of the so-called Banana Wars in the Caribbean, Vandegrift knew all about jungle fighting. Though he was astonished when he learned how little time his 1st Marine Division would have to prepare for the offensive, this gifted soldier put aside his concerns as he took on the business of leadership on the ground. Vandergrift's Marine Division was reinforced with paratroops. It was also supported by the 1st Marine Raider Unit under the command of Colonel Merritt Edson. Like his commander, Edson had combat experience, and it was for this reason that his raiders were given one of the most difficult tasks on the opening day of battle. Known to his men as Red Mike, Edson was a master of special tactics, and he would become one of the most celebrated soldiers of the Pacific War, with Guadalcanal the first location to witness his abilities as a leader of men. The Americans enjoyed no monopoly of excellent leadership at Guadalcanal. In charge of Japanese naval operations in the South Pacific was Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa. Prior to the American attack, Mikawa had expressed well-documented concerns about the fractured nature of the Japanese Pacific Command. But when fighting began, Mikawa would put his opinions to one side as he deployed his naval forces in brilliant style. Complementing Mikawa's naval forces, the Japanese regional ground presence consisted of the 17th Army of Lieutenant General Harukichi Hyakutake. General Hyakutake had a formidable force at his disposal. The 50,000 men that made up 17th Army included the 35th Infantry Brigade of Major General Kawaguchi, a commander who revealed his keenness for the fight as soon as he was engaged on Guadalcanal. A strong desire to get to grips with the enemy was also revealed by Colonel Kiyono Ichiki, a veteran of the war in China and a passionate believer in the prowess of the individual Japanese soldier. As commander of the 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, Colonel Ichiki had the chance to put his beliefs to the test in the first major land action on Guadalcanal itself. It would be an engagement where Colonel Ichiki revealed just how much motivation a commander can instill in his men. It would also be an action that would give rise to one of the most enduring myths about the Guadalcanal offensive. But there can be no doubt that Colonel Ichiki experienced at first hand the power of the weapons available to his enemy. The American triumph at the Battle of Midway proved once and for all the importance of powerful carrier aircraft. And of the dive bombers available to the American commanders, there was none better than the Douglas SBD, the Dauntless. All through the Pacific War, this two-seater warplane proved a menace to Japanese ships. With one 1,600-pound fuselage-mounted bomb and two 325-pound devices on the wings, this elegant aircraft was quick to prove its value against ground positions during the fighting at Guadalcanal. Colonel Ichiki's men would become especially aware of the Dauntless's power. American commanders were also able to deploy a great carrier-borne fighter in the Guadalcanal theater, the F-4F, the Wildcat, a single-seat fighter whose distinctive form was powered by a 1,200 horsepower engine generating a top speed of 318 miles per hour. By August 1942, the Wildcat had also seen action at Midway and at the Coral Sea. And though perhaps not as great a warplane as the Dauntless, the introduction of the Wildcat proved invaluable for the American efforts at Guadalcanal. The Bell P-400 was essentially an export version of the P-39 Airacobra, and as such lacked, amongst other components, the ability to fit oxygen bottles, giving it a maximum ceiling of 12,000 feet. Unusable as an interceptor, its formidable armament of one nose-mounted 37mm cannon, 2.50 caliber and 4.30 caliber machine guns, together with two 500-pound bombs, ideally suited the P-400 to the ground attack role. With its unusual tricycle undercarriage and the engine placed behind the pilot, the propeller drive shaft running between his legs, the P-400 was not popular with the men who flew it. Despite this valuable support from the air, Van der Grift and his colleagues knew that they would also need substantial amounts of ground resources for the kind of jungle warfare that lay ahead. The Marine troops themselves were a key resource. To get them from the transport ships to the shore, the American forces relied on landing craft like the LCI-L, the Landing Craft Infantry Large. In operation, this 160-foot vessel had the ability to deliver 210 troops to the beach via the ramp gangways fitted to either bow. The LCI-L could also be used to deliver 75 tons of material, and at Guadalcanal, American hardware on the ground included light, mobile tanks, well suited to jungle warfare. The most famous of these was the M3. First produced in 1941, its 6 guns were dominated by a main weapon of 37mm caliber. With armor up to 43mm thick, the M3 provided strong protection for its 4-man crew. Unfortunately, a problem with the disembarkation at the Guadalcanal beachhead meant that General Van der Grift could not call on as many of these fine vehicles as he had originally hoped. But the contribution of the M3 was still crucial in some of the fiercest engagements of the offensive. The conflict on Guadalcanal saw the use for the first time in a combat situation of the American-built Landing Vehicle Tract, or the Alligator, developed from the rescue craft used in the swamp areas of the southern USA in the mid-1930s. Powered by 2 Cadillac V8 engines, propulsion through the water came from paddles attached to the tracks, which would also help mobility on soft sandy beaches. Over 18,000 vehicles were built, including various models with differing offensive armaments, ranging from the fitting of tank turrets to the upper surfaces, through to the addition of 75mm howitzers. But the main benefit of the Alligator was its ability to drive straight out of the water and into cover before unloading its cargo, making it far less a target than ships, men, and supplies lined up on an exposed beach. Another American weapon that proved itself not only at Guadalcanal but also in subsequent jungle battles was the 75mm pack howitzer, the M1A1. Light and maneuverable, the pack howitzer was a long-established weapon in the American arsenal. Ideal for dropping by parachute, the M1A1 possessed a maximum range of some 9,700 yards, and the Japanese would feel the force of its 13-pound shells in the fighting of 1942. A light and versatile weapon, the 37mm gun, when used in the anti-tank role, fired a solid shot round that could penetrate 25mm of armor at 1,000 yards, and an armor-piercing round that could penetrate 58mm. Both types of rounds proved more than adequate in defeating the lightly armored tanks used by the Japanese on Guadalcanal. It was when used in the anti-personnel role that the 37mm gun proved its worth with devastating effect. Using canister fire, the gun was effectively turned into a 37mm shotgun. While posing little threat against tanks, it could decimate the frontal infantry attacks favored by the Japanese. Weighing in at 912 pounds, the gun was very light and could easily be dismantled and transported through the jungle. Over 18,000 were produced, and the gun was widely used in the Pacific Theatre.